What is up, kinfolk? So, I'm a huge Jordan Peterson fan. I remember watching him, or I first heard about him when there was that law in Canada. I also have his book, The 12 Rules of Life. I have not read it yet, but I need to, and I will. But I am a huge fan of his, and I do love watching his talks. There was a talk he did in regards to the Me Too movement, and this was a question that was posed by someone in the audience. So I'm going to give my reaction to it. So without further ado, let's get into it.
So my question is, as a redeemed progressive, what is the key to empowering men in the Me Too age while maintaining healthy boundaries and strong behavioural expectations?
We've had relatively reliable birth control since 1960. Okay, that's not very long. And we underestimate the unbelievable technological triumph of birth control. It's the hydrogen bomb, it's the transistor, like it's a major league transformation in human interaction. Women are now free from involuntary reproduction. That's never been the case in the entire history of the planet. Okay, we don't know exactly what to do about that.
That's for both sides. We're just now starting to come up with ideas for what that freedom and that liberation from having to have children has done. Some women have completely said they don't want to have kids. There's also the aspect of some people are more career driven. It's also bred a lot of discontent with a lot of men because there are men who are now competing with women. This is just facts that we see nowadays. This isn't to say it's either good or bad, but this is what we've observed because of the sexual liberation movement with the addition of having birth control. Another thing too is one of the biggest ways to end up in poverty back in the day was to have a child and be single, have a divorce. And another one is if your spouse or your husband died. Being a woman, you weren't necessarily allowed into a lot of the jobs of men. And the jobs you were allowed into, the wages weren't comparable to that of your husband when he were to pass or if he were to divorce you and leave you. Not a bad thing, not a great thing, just at this stage, it is what it is.
Okay, so the first idea in the 60s was, hell, let's party. And you could see why. It's like what the rules for not engaging in promiscuous sexual intercourse seemed to have vanished. So we had a couple of decades of experimentation. It's like, well, how'd that go? Little hard on the family, I would say. That's not so good for kids. AIDS, that wasn't a plus. Could have killed us all. And it mutated, particularly to take advantage of promiscuous sex, because viruses are very tricky things. So it turns out that sex is a little bit more complicated than we thought. Well, it actually turns out that it's a lot more complicated than we think. Okay, and now it's 50, 60 years later, and we're trying to sort this out. It's like, well, when is it okay to have sex? Exactly. And when is it not okay to have sex? And what does it mean that it's okay? And what does consent mean? And the answer to that is, well, we never used to have to think these things through because the rule was don't have sex until you get married.
And that's where I think even a lot of the issues that we're having now, people aren't marriage minded. Back in the day, if you had a child out of wedlock, you were supposed to get married. That was the way of making sure that the family stayed together and that the child was taken care of. Not saying that being from a single family guarantees that you're not going to be successful, but you're going to have a lot more roadblocks and things in your way that are going to prevent you from being as successful as being a part of a two-family home. It's going to teach you a lot more in a two-family home about the structure of how male and female dynamics work, especially when you see that as a norm. Because I feel like today, seeing two people married and who have been together for a long extended period of time, it's not as common as it once was, because once again, that was the culture. These are some pretty deep questions, and I think it's because, to his point, like you said, promiscuity. it leads to these things, because it's like, why do we have to talk about this? It's because promiscuity and because you're doing stuff outside of the realm of marriage.
That was the rule. Now that isn't the rule. Okay, so what's the rule? Well, we're not having a conversation about the rule. We're waiting till someone does something that seems like it might be untoward and then mobbing them and trying to extract the rule out that way. And it's not a very effective way of doing it. You know, you want to decrease campus rape? That's easy. Get rid of alcohol. No one has that conversation. It's like I did my PhD work on alcohol. 50% of the people who are murdered are drunk. And 50% of the people who kill them are drunk. And almost all the date rape situations are consequences of excess intoxication. But yet there's a party culture on campuses and anything goes. And you also have this strange thing, especially on the radical left, which is unbelievably paradoxical, where absolutely every form of sexual expression imaginable is 100% permissible because sex is fine, but it's so dangerous that while you're dancing with someone at a Princeton mixer, you have to ask them 2 or 3 times if it's okay for you to continue. And that's actually the case, by the way. I'm not making that up. It's like, well, both of those things can't be true. Now, what's happening, I think, on the Me Too end of things and the affirmative consent end of things is the old sexual taboos are reasserting themselves. The idea that we can extract sex out from emotional intimacy, and especially emotional intimacy, I would say, psychological intimacy, maybe even from long-term relationship, I don't believe it's a tenable idea. I don't think we can do it.
I don't think you could separate the emotional from the sexual. The way that I see sex and the way someone describes sex to me, sex is like fire. Fire in a fireplace is wonderful. It's something that you have to give attention to, but it's in a controlled environment versus a fire that you light right in the middle of the living room. Certain things will start to catch on fire. This can be in the form of a STD, abusive relationships. Now you have literally burned your house to the ground. And you can find people who will see, even though they see the rubble, they can still see value in it and want to try and rebuild. But if you're so focused on how bad your house has been damaged, you'll either lash out or you won't think you're worthy and you will just be like, no, leave me alone. Like he said, these are a lot of tough questions, like even the alcohol one. That was a great question to pose and to ask. And even when it comes to the whole consent thing, no one's going to ask that question because everybody, I feel like, is down for having a good time or very short-sighted without thinking of the long-term consequences. Having sex with just anybody is going to hurt you in the long run. In the short run, it's a great time. In the long run, it's going to lead to a lot of bad things, especially if it's not with someone who is genuine and who is definitely in your corner and who's down for the long haul.
And a lot of what we're seeing is the backlash against that. It's like, well, I feel used. You know, because one of the things that's happening on the really radical end of the anti-sexual abuse movement is the idea that, well, if you have intercourse with someone and then you regret it the next day, that's evidence that it wasn't consensual. Well, it is, in a sense, evidence that it wasn't consensual because it's evidence that you didn't bloody well think it through, right? It was good for last night, but it's not good for today. It's not very wise. The question is, well, what constitutes consent? And we need to have a very serious conversation about that. Like, under what circumstances is it acceptable to give consent? But we're not mature enough to have that conversation. We want it both ways. We want to be able to do whatever we want, with whoever we want, whenever we want, with no consequences, and we want there never to be any trouble about consent. It's like, well, no, that's not going to happen. I don't think that sex works very well outside of committed relationships.
Let's look at Tinder. Even Tinder as an app is known as the hookup app. And people don't want to be bothered with it. They know that that's not where they're going to find genuine relationships. Some people have, but it's like having to sift through a sea of garbage to find the one treasure that you actually want. That's why a lot of people have just checked out in general. Having a sense of self-worth and knowing what you will and will not go for, and having a long-term mindset of like, I don't want to hurt myself right now. But we're not thinking about that. Like you said, that's also to his point. Like, that's not something that you're considering in the moment, especially if you're intoxicated, because your mind is not 100% there.
I don't think there's any evidence that it does. There's a strong proclivity across cultures for the enforcement, social enforcement of long-term monogamy. And there's reasons for that. And I think you deviate from that at your peril. So now, if you want to deviate from that, there's all sorts of reasons to do it. And I can understand why people are interested in adventure and all of that. But, my sense also as a clinician is, you only really get to try out about 5 people in your life. You have to make a decision pretty damn quick. Like between 20 and 30, there's a lot of things to get straight, and long-term mate is usually one of them. And most of the time, people should be more careful with their sexual behavior when they're young, especially when they're drunk, than they are. And I just think it's so interesting that all of the taboo reconstruction is coming from the radical left.
That also, I don't think it's that far-fetched, because a lot of people who are on the conservative side are typically very religious and they hold true to their religious beliefs. Also very interesting that what is being taught is that you should be, like you said, the hallmark for finding somebody and finding a mate is between your 20s and your 30s. And during that time, we're told between our 20s and our 30s that we're supposed to be the most sexually liberated. If you're going to date a guy, you need to have experience. So you need to go out there and experience stuff, so that way when you come across a guy that you genuinely like, you know how to hold it down. There's the aspect of like, hey, man, you have time. You can sleep with as many women as you want to, and then eventually you'll find a girl who you'll settle down with. There's the aspect of you should live it up at this time because YOLO. But all of this, like he said, is breeding and is creating a culture that we see today that a lot of us hate and want out of. But this all stems, to his point, from a culture of promiscuity. You could have done this stuff back in the day, but to the level at which we're seeing it and how many people are acting on it today, it could have never happened. One of the beauties about birth control, but one of the also bad sides about birth control, in my opinion.
You'd think it'd be the damn right-wing Christians complaining about, sexual immorality. It's like, no, it's the radical lefties. You have to have signed consent before making any physical move. And then that's so what? Really? Who thought that up? That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. You know how awkward that would be? You're supposed to be able to do a little bit of nonverbal reading, right? I mean, that's part of romance. You ever see a movie where the 2 people who are dating exchange consent notes? Like, that doesn't happen.
Bro, that would be rom-coms are already terrible, but that would be a terrible rom-com if there was that would be that would be the comedy of a rom-com nowadays, is the constant asking of consent. When you're in tune with someone and you feel the vibe and you know it's there, it's a beautiful thing. Versus like, I'm feeling this, but I don't know if she's feeling it. Can I hold your hand? Niggas, people can't even look at women in the gym anymore. Did you see that video? Absolutely insane. Crazy.
So it's an unrealistic solution. But I think the real solution is that despite the fact that we have reliable birth control, we're going to have to relearn what the acceptable rules of propriety are with regards to sexual relationships. One of the things I often tell my young clients is, don't do anything physically with anyone that you wouldn't talk to them about. Because if you're too damn embarrassed to talk about it, well, maybe it's a little premature in the relationship to actually do it. And then there's harm in it. There's emotional harm in it on both parties. There's the cheapening of both parties. So it's going to take us a long time to sort this out. But hopefully we can do it in a serious manner, and it won't be merely a matter of mobbing those who seem to have made an error. So.
Good job, Jordan. To his point, having a conversation with somebody, even before you guys have become intimate, it lays down the ground rules for where you stand in the relationship and what they're looking for. It comes down to both men and women knowing exactly what they want from a relationship. But like he said, the conversations aren't being had, and they're very difficult conversations to have, especially at a young age. To expect children to have the capability and the mindset to make the proper decisions about a long-term thing, they're very short-sighted. I mean, I thought high school was my whole entire life until it wasn't. But let me know what you guys think, kinfolk. How do you feel about the whole liberation movement and the invention of contraception? Let me know in the comment section below. And if you made it this far, go ahead and like the video and subscribe for the next one. And as always, kinfolk, I love you, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.